as well. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, a very, very important verse that is one of those that just, honestly, it was just 2 or 3 years ago, it jumped off the page at me. And although I had preached through the book of Ecclesiastes once before, I never saw it, not like I have here. But I want to share a thought out of the book of Ecclesiastes, just some food for thought. The pastor's already talked about going. Some go, and some go here in the States, some go overseas, and we want to see as many of the men and boys from Volusia County Baptist Church to get the call to be able to go and go to another place and be able to plant churches or get involved right here in serving the Lord and doing our very best for the Lord as well. But now we're talking about giving, and there's going to be a commitment made in just a moment. The pastor will be up here and take the commitments. But before that, one thing, and this is dealing with money. By the way, you don't want to get up and go get water fountain or the bathroom or anything else right now, because we're all going to be thinking funny things about leaving the money part. But this is about our giving now. What am I going to do with it? And I remind us how important it is. But look in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, and a good verse to underline in your Bible. Notice what he says in verse 13, one verse. There is a sore evil which I have seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof, notice, to their hurt. And I saw that, I thought, whoa, are you kidding me? You mean it's possible that I can hang on to too much of God's money to my hurt? Is a sore evil, he said. It's an evil. Say, oh, but I'm saving up for retirement, or I'm enjoying my retirement right now, or I'm saving up for my kids' inheritance, or I'm whatever. There's a sore evil, Solomon said, which I've seen under the sun, namely, riches kept for the owners thereof to their hurt. And I want to encourage all of us to think about tonight launching out a little bit when it comes to making our commitment that we have and serving the Lord. We've heard from our missionary evangelists this week, and they say, I've listened carefully to both of these men of God and their families, but I've listened to both of them in their presentation and watched and I thought, thank the Lord, they've got the right philosophy, they know what they're doing and where they're going. But basically, what a missionary evangelist does is, as is called of God, our churches, like yours, have a part of their finances. We send them out. They go to another field. Normally, they have to spend a little bit of time, I say a little bit of time, depending on where they go, time in learning a language, or for some, it's like the Canavan, there's probably a lifetime endeavor of learning a language. I mean, there's nothing easy about some of these foreign languages, but they're working on languages and learning the culture. And once they get a little bit of that and they get familiar with it, then they start working in a church usually and helping another church out, where another older missionary, someone's been there for a while, where they can kind of on-the-job training that are there. And they're learning from that as well. And then they launch out on their own and they start another church, knocking on doors, talking to people about Christ, seeing people get saved, and they get a few people, a handful of people, just like we do here in the States. And then we start banding together and start a church, and they work together as a church and keep adding to it. And then eventually they're praying that God will not only save some man or young man, but call one of them into the ministry. They get called in the ministry, then you teach and train them. And they set up Bible institutes or colleges and work to teach and train these men how to preach, how to counsel, how to help, how to knock on doors, how to care about people. I mean, a number of things. I mean, how to do the weddings and the funerals and all of it. So they spend time teaching them to eventually take the church and maybe turn it over to one of those men, or take those men and go out someplace else and start other churches for the Lord. That's what they're doing. That's what makes them different than a pastor. A pastor goes to one place and stays there. The evangelist, the missionary evangelist, goes to a place and starts a church and gets it going and then works himself out of a job and tries to go out and then starts another church somewhere. So that's what they do. That's what they'll do for their life if the Lord should tarry and allow them to continue to work for it. But the time is short before the Lord returns. The time is short when I can be involved in talking to people about Jesus Christ. The time is short when I can make a commitment and take a Faith Promise missions card like this and make a commitment on it. I think, well, I'm going to just try a little bit here. But no, it's going to take a little bit. It's going to take some effort. It's going to take some faith on our part as well to have a part in it. But the time is short, and I've got to do what I do now aggressively, rolling up my sleeves spiritually and saying, Lord, I'm all in. Count me in. I want to have a great part, a big part. I want to do more than I've ever done before. I want that commitment. I think now it's kind of like emergency mode. I mean, how many of you really believe Jesus Christ could come back this week? Amen. Hey, sure he could. I mean, if you're born again and have ever read anything in the Bible, Jesus is coming again. We don't know when he's coming. But I look at it as kind of like, we're living now in a day and time that's kind of like the emergency mode. I mean, hey, we've got to do what we can do now to rescue the perishing and care for the dying. I mean, now's the time to be able to do it. I remember one time when we lived in Fairfax, when I was pastoring there, I had an invitation to go down in the Tidewater area down by Williamsburg and Virginia Beach in that area. And to Virginia Beach on a Saturday night to preach in a youth rally there. And I thought about it. I said, no, I'll never do that because it's about a 4-hour drive. And if I get finished about 10 o'clock, I wouldn't get in until 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And then I've got to preach, on Sunday morning. I thought, that ain't going to work. And then I was talking with it. My brother-in-law said, well, hey, Bud, said, I'd be more than happy to fly you down there. And so we rented a little plane, and he was going to fly me down. He flew me down. I preached. And then it was time to come back. It was about 9 o'clock or so that night. And we went to the airport to get in the plane. And this little plane, and by the way, you've seen these big caterpillars. This is something about that size, or a monarch butterfly, maybe. But I mean, this was a little teeny weeny plane that we were in, 2-passenger plane. Now, I'm not afraid of planes. Although the first times I flew in planes, I jumped out of them. I was a paratrooper when I was in the military. But as long as I had a parachute on my back, I was totally comfortable in planes. But it took me a while to get used to not having a parachute on my back, being up in a plane. But we were in this little plane, and it just so happened it was raining that Saturday night when we were about to come back. And he's got this little thing. I mean, they just wind that little propeller up, and they got this little 2-seater. That's the only seat. I was the co-pilot. I've never been up in the front. There's something about when you sit in the back of a plane and there's a storm or rain or dark, you look outside and you think, hey, I can't see a thing, but thank the Lord, the pilot, they know where they're going. They can see out there. They can't see any more than you can see. I mean, it's all the same. And it was scary when I saw that. So we get up and we're going along about 5,000 feet, exactly 5,000 feet. And we were rounding Richmond from down in Virginia Beach, rounding Richmond coming up to Washington, D.C. And as we were going around, we're still up there. The guy on the air traffic control fellow says, hey, we need you to take it up another 1,000 feet. So he said, okay, so he's taking it up another 1,000 feet. My brother-in-law and I, we were just talking, enjoying it. As we're going along, all of a sudden, there was a pow! I thought, what in thunder was that? It wasn't thunder, unfortunately. It was the plane. And I was looking at these dials, and my brother-in-law starts touching everything. But I was looking at these dials as we're going up, and I don't know how to read the dials, but except for the one that said altimeter. It was going like this, and all of a sudden when that PAL came, it started going like this. And I thought, that's not a good sign, particularly when you don't have a parachute on your back. And I knew I shouldn't have gotten on that thing without a parachute. But anyhow, I mean, it was scary when I saw this is emergency. My brother-in-law immediately, he was an experienced B-52 bomber pilot, so he knew all about flying. So he goes through all the emergency procedures. All I knew was we were losing power and we were losing altitude. So he calls back and says, I need to make an emergency landing. Where's the closest airport? They said, well, back to Richmond. We just passed Richmond. So we turned around and went back to Richmond. As we're going back to it, as he's flying. It wasn't 5 minutes later, and all of a sudden, he hit an air pocket, and the plane just dropped out of the sky of several hundred feet. We just dropped, both of us, hit our heads on the ceiling of the airplane, and we hit our head and came back, and then I see him, he's kind of like one of these Broncos, you know, he's just trying to steer it. And I mean, you talking about a prayer warrior, you're looking at one who was a prayer warrior then. I mean, I pray, I said, oh my Lord, please. I thought about all my sins. I confessed every sin I had, every sin I thought I'd be committing the next week or two. I confessed all of them ahead of time. And then I thought, just in case my brother-in-law's got something, I confessed his sin. I mean, I confessed everything I could confess because we were in an emergency, and you do what you have to do when you're in an emergency. And ladies and gentlemen, I remind us tonight, with one lost sinner on their way to a Christless hell, that means we who have the good news, we can tell them there is hope out there. There's an escape out there. If you just put your trust in Jesus, he'll take you down to smooth landing. By the way, we found out later, we lost one cylinder that froze up. And keep in mind, this thing only had 4. I mean, we're not talking about a big Rolls-Royce engine. This is a little 4, probably Volkswagen, but it now only had 3 cylinders operating, and finally got that thing down. We took a bus. By the way, just so you know that I was prepared, we went back, we got a taxi into Richmond, we called a Trailways bus, we went into Washington, D.C., turned around, took a cab, came back, and anyhow, I was able to get home about 6 o'clock that morning. I really felt refreshed for preaching that morning. But I'm simply saying, hey, there was an emergency there. Faith. Now we're going to have an opportunity. Faith to fill out. Faith, what I do. And by the way, wonderful privilege to have a Faith Promise Missions Conference, or Grace Giving as the Bible talks about it, because normally, and our church started out, the first 7 years our church was started back in 1970, and we had our missions included in on our budget. But what we would do is, staff or deacons and I, we would work on our budget. We'd put an X number of dollars for missions, and that would all go to missions. And then we'd vote on the budget. Do you know how much faith that took all the individual people out there? It took no faith at all, because it's in the budget. Whatever the pastor decides, or the deacons, or staff, whatever, they kind of write it out. But here, you decide how much you give for world evangelism. You're the one we look to the bottom line in doing. But it takes faith. So exercise a little bit of faith, if you could. I would close with this one thought here as well. Years ago, my wife and I went and I spoke in a camp at the Wilds Camp in North Carolina. If you've ever been to the Wilds, they had a family camp there. And my wife and I went and spoke that week. And but anyhow, so we got to meet a lot of people. Well, back then, too, this was back in the 80s. This was in 1989. My wife would write and correspond letters with her mother back in Richmond. We were 100 miles away in Fairfax. So they wrote back and forth. And some of the young people here, you might not, this is called a letter. This is what they used to look like. This was done with they call them typewriters, but they don't have those anymore. But back in the old days when we were getting going, you know, we had this. So Mary would write, my wife would write to her mom, and mom would write back. So this is a letter that her mother kept. And it's just one page of it. I'm going to read one paragraph of it as well, because it kind of shows a point as well that I was sharing with you. And here's something. So Mary's writing this August 1st, 1989, that she writes it to her mother. It said, Dear Mom and Dad, he said, I just thought of a cute little story we heard this past week. One of the men at the Wilds Camp told us about his little boy. His boy was about 5 years old and was playing in his sandbox. He had heard about how, as a Christian, you can ask the Lord for things and then get them. So he prayed that God would make his sandbox like Noah's Ark, and the ground around him an ocean. When his dad heard about this, he asked, Well, son, what happened? Did he do it? And his son then told him that he didn't do it, but that was because he had sin in his heart that he needed to get taken care of, with a little friend that crossed the street to ask for forgiveness for something bad he had done, and then asked his sister to forgive him for something, and then went back out to his sandbox. And by the way, if I could pause here, I'm telling you, it's a spiritual kid. Any boy that asks a sister for forgiveness is spiritual. I had 4 sisters. I mean, I don't know if I ever did it to one of them, but I mean, any boy that's ever done that, we're talking spiritual kid here. So anyhow, so his dad, after that, so fine, he said, after that, he went back out to his sandbox. This time he prayed and asked God to make his sandbox an airplane so he could fly around the sky. Then his dad asked him again, well, son, did he do it? No, the boy responded, but he was just getting ready to when I remembered, Dad, I don't know how to fly an airplane, so I stopped him just in time. And I thought, boy, if that isn't faith. I wonder, do you have faith to turn a sandbox into an airplane? This kid, he thought that was going to happen. We're not asked to do anything like that, but we are asked to do our best for Jesus. People are lost without Christ. We want to do what we can to reach a world for our wonderful Savior.